There are a lot of different definitions of early voting. The one that Pennsylvania still does not have, and about a dozen states don't have any form of this, is allowing voters to come in before Election Day to some type of polling location. It can be at the county level, multiple locations. It might just be the county seat. But it allows you to come in. You don't have to request an absentee ballot, and you prove your identity one way or the other and are able to vote a regular ballot. The ballot looks just like a ballot you would do on Election Day in your own local precinct. Those windows might be as much as a month before Election Day. So we actually have early voting that's going on even before the Iowa caucuses in some states, even though we don't really talk about it. In Florida, for instance, it's a 2-week period. And about 40% of voters in Florida actually vote before Election Day in person, voting a paper ballot just like they would on Election Day. Pennsylvania doesn't have it. Pennsylvania has a form of early voting that is very widespread across the country, although Pennsylvania is late to the game with respect to no-excuse absentee ballots. And no-excuse absentee ballots are essentially what it sounds like. You don't have to have an excuse not to be around on Election Day in order to be able to request, either online or by mail or in person, a ballot that you can then later mail in. Absentee ballots are very popular, certainly traditionally among people who are more elderly. Pennsylvania has had to have an excuse until just the last election cycle, and as a result, very few people had the excuse in order to get an absentee ballot. Again, other states, not only is it a third, some states like Oregon and Washington and now Colorado, all of their voting on Election Day now takes place before Election Day, in that you are mailed an automatic absentee ballot and you are able to return it in person or by mail.
So what is it? Are there any patterns to what drives some of these changes to take place across states?
That's a really good question. It could be just the culture that you have, the idea that let's make voting easier and we're going to see about making it more convenient for voters so they don't have to come on that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and extend the absentee ballot or make it an all-mail ballot election like those states that I mentioned. Others, there's certainly a political game going on, and it's often on partisan lines, where Democrats generally want to expand the electorate, make it more easy to vote. One way to do that is to give people more opportunities to turn out to vote, either in person or by getting an absentee ballot and mailing it in. We've seen efforts to curtail this. So certainly there's been efforts successful in North Carolina, in Ohio, and in Florida. They've been challenged through the federal courts about cutting back on these efforts, sometimes bipartisan, because the demographics of those who take advantage, especially of early in-person voting, doesn't necessarily help Republicans. And so we've seen these efforts to get rid of the final Sunday of early voting, the souls to the polls, as it's often known, because African Americans in Florida or in Ohio or North Carolina were disproportionately using that. So the Republican legislature wanted to curtail it. And Pennsylvania is a good example of saying, well, why do we have to have early in-person voting on Sundays? We have it for 2 weeks. Pennsylvania doesn't even have it. So how are we possibly stripping people of their voting rights when other states like Pennsylvania aren't giving this option at all?
Yeah. Let's talk more about the kind of demographics of it all. So you just started to touch on it there. What do we know about the people who show up to vote early in person?
Yeah. So the early in-person voting is certainly geared to people who can't necessarily come out to vote easily on a Tuesday. And so what we have seen is certainly in the states that have had it, a demographic on those early voting days that isn't necessarily representative of the overall electorate. It happens to be more people of color, more women. Younger voters are often using early in-person voting. Now, there's a lot of differences. Absentee voting, if you want to think about that as a convenience voting, has typically been among older people, whiter people, more partisans, people who have already made up their decision on how to vote. They don't need to wait for an 11th hour surprise. They're going to vote a Republican or Democratic ticket. And so we've seen that pretty persistent. The early voting is the one where certainly in Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, states that have had fairly extensive early in-person voting, disproportionately African Americans, more so than Hispanics, are using early in-person voting.